Before she reached the age of 15, he had impregnated his own daughter twice. The story of Willard Dawson is one of the most incestuous fathers ever exposed in Georgia, a case that shocked the small community of Rabun Gap back in the 1970s. A family isolated in the Appalachian Mountains saw their dark secrets remain buried for generations, until an inevitable collapse revealed a reality many would have preferred never to know. Rabun Gap, Georgia, in 1978, was a mountainous region where time seemed to run more slowly than in the rest of the country. Their own traditions were maintained by isolated communities, protected by deep valleys and precarious roads that made access difficult for outsiders. It was in this scenario that the Dawson family built a reality of their own, a world away from external scrutiny and the laws that govern conventional society. A descendant of one of the first families to settle in that region in the early 19th century was Willard Dawson, aged 42 in 1978. As pioneers, his ancestors had arrived, settling the tall lands where a small rural property was built. For their isolation and a deep distrust of strangers, the Dawsons became known over generations, rarely coming down to the city except to acquire essential supplies. Located at the end of a dirt road that became impassable during heavy rain, the Dawson property was approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest city. A visibly deteriorated, two-story wooden structure built by Willard's grandfather served as the main house. Completing the property where Willard, his wife Martha, and their 5 children lived were a partially collapsed barn, a water well, and some areas of cultivation. Willard's second-degree cousin was Martha Dawson, born Martha Collins. When she was only 16, the two had married, following a family standard of unions between relatives dating back generations. An erased countenance was what Martha had, with eyes always lowered, and she rarely spoke when strangers were present. The result of a life of deprivation and the physical and emotional wear from multiple pregnancies in precarious conditions was why, at 38, she appeared much older. 5 children were what the couple had: 3 boys, Jacob, 19, Thomas, 17, and Samuel, 10, and 2 girls, Sarah, 15, and Rebecca, 8. Similar physical characteristics were shared by all: below average stature, asymmetrical features, and obvious dental problems. Signs of erratic behavior were already shown by Jacob and Thomas, alternating between periods of apathy and explosions of aggression that were unexplained. When Sarah Dawson, then 15, was taken to the regional hospital after fainting during a rare visit to the city with her father, the story we are about to report began to surface. Opening the doors for an investigation that would reveal decades of a practice modern society considers one of the greatest taboos was what doctors discovered that day: improper relationships between family members, which resulted in children with serious development problems. You should check to see if you are already subscribed to this channel, so you don't miss impactful stories that reveal the darkest secrets of American families. Subscribe now if you are not. Truths that few have the courage to tell, but that need to be known so they are never repeated, are what these are. The day Sarah Dawson arrived at Clayton's Community Hospital is something Dr. Richard Thornton still remembers clearly. A cold October morning in 1978 was when the 15-year-old was unconscious as her father carried her into the emergency room. That his daughter had passed out while carrying shopping was what Willard Dawson explained, adding that it wasn't the first time this had happened in recent weeks. From the first moment, there was something about his behavior that bothered me, Dr. Thornton said years later. His avoidance of eye contact, his insistence on being by her side, his nervousness when we suggested more detailed tests. That Sarah was extremely anemic and dehydrated was revealed by the initial exam, but it was during a more complete assessment that the truth began to emerge. In her 5th month, approximately, was the pregnant teenager. Visibly agitated grew Willard when confronted with this information, insisting he must take his daughter home immediately. It was at this critical moment that nurse Elaine Parker, with over 20 years of experience in delicate cases, intervened. Signs of possible vulnerability were realized by her, creating a private moment with Sarah while her father was referred to fill out administrative forms. When we finally stayed alone, about the pregnancy is what I asked her, Elaine reported later. With the emptiest eyes I've ever seen, she looked at me and said simply, "Dad said it's like that with all the girls in our family." The first indication of the horror happening on the Dawson property was this dialogue, spoken almost in a whisper. The local authorities were immediately called by the medical team upon noticing the severity of the situation. At the hospital less than an hour later arrived Sheriff David Miller, who commanded the Rabun County Police Department at the time. For questioning was Willard arrested, while under medical observation was Sarah kept. A search warrant for the Dawson property was obtained by the authorities, where Martha and the other 4 children were found. Alarming living conditions were revealed by the house. Although electricity from a diesel generator was present, running water and a proper sewage system were absent. Scarcely furnished were the rooms, with mattresses scattered across the floor in some rooms. Mostly canned goods and some vegetables from the family garden was the little food in the pantry. However, most disturbing was the discovery of a girl of about 2 years old hidden in a room at the back of the house. Several worrying physical characteristics were what the child, not on any official record, had: a head disproportionate to her body, eyes set very wide apart, and difficulties with moving and communicating. Through tears, Martha Dawson, when asked about the child, revealed that this was Emma, Sarah's daughter, and that Emma's father, according to Martha, was Willard himself. That Sarah had given birth to Emma when she was only 13 was revealed by preliminary investigations. Never officially registered, never having received medical attention, and unknown to any authority was the girl's existence. Pregnant again was Sarah now, also by her father. An even more disturbing picture began to emerge as the investigation advanced. That Sarah had attended the local school only until she was 10 was shown by school records, when Willard stated he would educate her at home, something that never happened. Early had the 3 boys also abandoned school, while Rebecca, the youngest, had never been enrolled. That they rarely saw members of the Dawson family was reported by neighbors from the nearest properties, even if a few kilometers distant. Maybe 3 or 4 times a year they appeared in town, always with 1 or 2 of his children, never the whole family, a local merchant reported. Large amounts of supplies were bought by them before they returned to the mountains. Willard would cut it fast and leave if you tried to start a conversation. Mainly from the occasional sale of animal skins that Willard and the older children hunted was how the investigation revealed the family survived, as well as from small-scale subsistence farming. That the Dawsons had received a significant inheritance from a distant relative in the early 1960s was shown by ancient documents, which explained how they could maintain the property despite limited income. But just beginning to be revealed was the darker aspect. At least 3 previous generations was how far back the family's patterns of consanguinity dated. That Willard's grandparents were first-degree cousins was indicated by ancient county records, as were their parents. An extremely closed genetic lineage had been created by this pattern of relationships between close relatives, resulting in a number of physical and cognitive problems that became more evident with each new generation. Through the fragments of information she shared with the social worker designated for her case, Elena Winters, Sarah Dawson's story began to take shape as she recovered her strength in the hospital. Gradually, the teenager's confidence was gained by Elena with patience and sensitivity, a teenager who had been raised to distrust anyone outside the family. What had been taught her throughout her life was clearly reproduced when Sarah repeated, "The world outside is dangerous and full of people who want to separate us. That only within our family could we be truly safe was what Dad always said." Deeply disturbing was the reality emerging from these conversations. According to Sarah, when she turned 12, differently began her father to treat her. That in their family, it was tradition for parents to teach their daughters what their adult life would be like was what he explained. Quietly complicit had been Martha, her mother, having herself had a similar experience with her own father decades earlier. When Sarah became pregnant for the first time at 13, for medical attention, there was no search. Using knowledge transmitted through generations, Martha acted as a midwife in Emma's birth. A disturbing lack of understanding of what had really happened was demonstrated by Sarah when asked how she felt giving birth. "Special because I managed to give the family a new perfect member was what Dad said I was," she explained with devastating simplicity. That Emma was more perfect than the others because she came straight from him to me was what he said. The devastating impact of the isolation and horror she had lived was revealed by Sarah's medical and psychological evaluations. Chronologically, she was 15, but her cognitive and emotional development was significantly delayed. Difficulty understanding abstract concepts was shown by her. She had a limited vocabulary, and more worryingly, no awareness that what she had suffered was wrong was shown by her. If you are feeling deeply impacted by this story, you are not alone. In the comments, "Justice for Sarah" is what you should leave to show that we cannot tolerate children growing up in environments of exploitation and neglect. So these stories are never forgotten. Your voice is important. Meanwhile, more layers of this disturbing case were revealed by the investigation into the other family members. Clear signs of cognitive deficit were shown by Jacob and Thomas, the older children. That both had intellectual development equivalent to that of children aged 9 to 10 was indicated by psychological evaluations, despite being 19 and 17 years old, respectively. Significant developmental delays, as well as health problems like hearing difficulties, congenital heart issues, and dental malformations, were also shown by Samuel, 10, and Rebecca, 8. A series of medical evaluations was undergone by Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, which confirmed the initial suspicions. Multiple conditions resulting from consanguinity were what the 2-year-old girl had. In addition to the observed physical characteristics, heart problems, low immunity, and a significant delay in neuromotor development were detected. That she would probably never develop cognitive abilities beyond those of a 4 or 5-year-old child, even in adulthood, was estimated by doctors. That her own story mirrored Sarah's was revealed by Martha Dawson when she finally started talking to the authorities. The daughter of a first-degree cousin of Willard's father was Martha, born Martha Collins. To Willard as his wife was she offered at age 15, continuing a cycle that, according to her, was considered normal within that family branch. That this was how things were always done was what my mother told me, Martha explained in a recorded statement. That keeping the family blood pure was important, that mixing with strangers brought weakness was what she said. Deep historical roots are what the investigation revealed this thinking had. From the Scottish Appalachians in the early 19th century came the Dawsons' ancestors, bringing beliefs about the importance of maintaining pure family strains. In the Georgia mountains, isolated far from the social and cultural evolution of the rest of the country, these distorted beliefs not only survived but intensified over generations. When investigators found diaries belonging to Willard's grandfather, written between 1910 and 1935, came the most alarming discovery. In detail, his disturbing vision for preserving family purity was described by Edwin Dawson in these diaries, and how he had instructed his son, Willard's father, to continue this practice. Almost clinical observations about the results of these unions were also contained in the diaries, noting the physical characteristics of children born and which were considered successful or flaws. That the practice of consanguinity in the Dawson family was not an isolated case involving Willard, but a deliberate system maintained for generations, resulting in an increasingly compromised genetic line, was the crucial evidence provided by these documents. In March 1979, Willard Dawson's trial began, quickly becoming one of the most notorious cases in Georgia's legal history. A meticulously built case supported by physical evidence, medical records, and the devastating testimonies of Dawson family members was presented by the prosecution, led by Howard Reeves. The public interest could barely be accommodated by the Rabun County Court, a red brick building from the beginning of the century. Each development was followed by journalists from Atlanta and even national publications, while the fact that such horror had existed for so long, so close to them was tried to be processed by Clayton's small community. Throughout the process, Willard remained impassive, rarely showing any emotion. An argument based on his client's cultural isolation and ignorance of modern social laws and norms was tried to be built by his defense lawyer, a state-designated professional who clearly struggled with the nature of the case. The product of generations of isolation in the mountains is my client, argued the lawyer. That these practices were normal within his family was what he was raised believing, without access to proper education that could have corrected this distorted view. However, quickly dismantled was this argument by the prosecution, which had evidence that Willard frequently went to the city, had a functional radio on the property, and had even worked briefly in a local sawmill in the early 1960s before inheriting the family property. That his actions were condemned by society was sufficiently understood by him, with his knowledge of the outside world, argued prosecutor Reeves. From Martha Dawson came the most impactful testimony. After months of psychological counseling, decades of conditioning were finally broken by her, allowing her to talk about her experience. In a trembling voice, how she was handed over to Willard as a teenager was described by her, how she was kept isolated, and how she eventually became a silent accomplice to the horrors perpetuated against her own daughter. Wrong was what I knew it was, she admitted, tears running down her face. But when you spend a lifetime being taught that questioning means treason to the family, the ability to oppose is lost by you. My daughter was who I failed, and for it, I will never forgive myself. In detail, the devastating effects of continued consanguinity over generations were explained by the medical and psychological experts who testified. A detailed study of the Dawson family tree was presented by Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a geneticist at Emory University, demonstrating how the increasingly restricted genetic pool had resulted in a concentration of harmful recessive genes. A textbook example of the dangers of endogamy is what we see in the Dawson family, explained Dr. Freeman. Dramatically increases the likelihood that harmful recessive genes manifest when close relatives have children together. For at least 4 consecutive generations, where this practice has occurred in this family, a cascade of genetic problems that have become progressively more severe is what we see. How the problems observed in Willard and Martha's older children, from cognitive deficits to heart problems and physical malformations, were direct consequences of this pattern was described by the doctor. But when discussing Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, his testimony became most impactful. What we call extreme endogamic depression is what this child represents, he explained. An even greater concentration of problematic recessive genes is the result when a father has improper relationships with his own daughter, who is already the product of a consanguineous lineage. 70% is what the chances of serious developmental and health problems exceed. That the fetus already showed signs of multiple developmental complications was indicated by medical reports on Sarah's second pregnancy, still underway during the trial. That the child would likely have even more severe conditions than Emma was predicted by doctors if the pregnancy reached term. How such a situation could exist for so long without intervention was begun to be questioned by the community as the trial advanced. For not properly investigating when the Dawson children stopped attending classes were criticized local school officials. About the lack of accompaniment visits to the isolated family with multiple children faced questions social assistance authorities. To the systemic failure that allowed the Dawson tragedy to continue for generations was directed part of his accusation by prosecutor Reeves. Of one man is not just the judgment this, he declared in his final argument. Of a society that closed its eyes, a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable, and a culture of silence that allowed the unthinkable to happen just a few kilometers from where we are sitting today is the trial this. After 7 days of trial and only 4 hours of deliberation, with the verdict returned the jury. On all counts was Willard Dawson found guilty. The maximum sentence permitted by Georgia law at the time was issued by Judge William Hartford, visibly shaken by the case, 3 consecutive 25-year prison sentences, ensuring Willard would never leave prison. Since the Dawson case shocked Georgia and the entire country, 45 years have passed. Not only for the survivors but also as a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and community neglect, the consequences of that terrible history continue to reverberate. At Georgia's state penitentiary in 1997, Willard Dawson died at age 61, never expressing remorse for his actions. After serving 5 years in prison for complicity, Martha spent the rest of her life in a community-assisted living facility for people with mental disorders. She died in 2012 of heart complications, another common result of generations of consanguinity. Several paths were followed by the fate of the Dawson children, all marked by trauma and the genetic consequences of their birth. Due to their cognitive limitations, Jacob and Thomas, the older children, were never able to live independently. In institutions for adults with disabilities spent decades both. Thomas died in 2010 due to renal failure, and Jacob still lives under supervised care. The opportunity to receive specialized education and intensive care was had by Samuel, who was only 10 when his family was discovered. Although his cognitive deficits were never completely overcome by him, a craft was eventually managed to be learned by him, and he lives today in an assisted community where he works in an adapted carpentry workshop. Perhaps the one who responded best to the intervention was Rebecca, the youngest daughter. By a family of university professors was she adopted, receiving special education and extensive therapeutic support. Despite her learning difficulties, the equivalent of high school was able to be completed by her, and she works today as an assistant in a local library, having found stability and a significant degree of independence. A long and difficult path of recovery was faced by Sarah Dawson, whose involuntary courage exposed the case. A boy with multiple serious conditions who died before his first year was the result of her second pregnancy. In intensive psychological treatment spent years Sarah, gradually understanding the magnitude of what she had suffered. An extraordinary step was taken by her at 19. She decided to speak publicly about her experience. In an interview for an educational documentary in 1982, Sarah, then with a clearer understanding of what she had lived, expressed her desire that her story serve as a warning. "That was normal or acceptable is what I don't want anyone else growing up thinking," she said at the time. "That isolation is not protection is what I want people to understand. A prison is what it is." Under specialized care grew up Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, facing multiple medical and developmental challenges. Despite pessimistic predictions, some expectations were exceeded by her, managing to develop basic communication skills and some degree of independence in everyday activities. However, the cognitive development of a 6-year-old child was never exceeded by her. At age 25 in 2001, Emma died due to congenital cardiac complications. A life for herself was eventually managed to be built by Sarah. After years of therapy and remedial education, a teacher's aide she met during a rehabilitation program was who she married. No more children were there, a conscious decision based on both her trauma and the genetic risks she carried. To volunteering in programs for preventing family isolation and detecting warning signs was how she dedicated her adult life. By order of the county was the Dawson property in the Georgia mountains eventually demolished, which considered the site a monument to human tragedy. The area has been reforested and is now part of a nature reserve, without any indication of the horror that existed there for decades. Its impact on public policies and social conscience, however, was the most important legacy of the Dawson case. After the trial, their child protection and family monitoring protocols for remote areas were completely revised by the state of Georgia. New laws were implemented, requiring regular checks on families who opted for home education and creating a more robust school abandonment detection system. Valuable lessons were also learned by the medical community from the case. Specific protocols to identify signs of improper relationships were developed by the Clayton Community Hospital, and training for health professionals across the region began to include modules on detecting genetic problems that may indicate consanguinity. Extensively studied by genetics experts were the Dawson medical records, scientifically documenting the devastating effects of multiple generations of consanguinity. In educational programs around the world are now used these studies, clearly illustrating why taboos against relationships between close relatives exist in virtually all human cultures. In 2008, Project Sarah was the name given to a prevention and education center in honor of Sarah Dawson and her survival journey. Located in Atlanta, the center offers educational resources and support for survivors of improper relationships, as well as training for professionals to identify signals from at-risk families. In 2019, at age 56, Sarah passed away, leaving a legacy of courage and transformation. Dozens of professionals who had been inspired by her history to work in protecting vulnerable children were present at her funeral. That her story be told not as sensationalism, but as a painful and necessary reminder that extreme isolation can create spaces where the unthinkable becomes reality was one of her last wishes. That even in the deepest shadows of society, the possibility of intervention, healing, and change exists is what the Dawson history reminds us. Our collective responsibility to be aware of the signs that something is wrong, not to look away from discomfort, and to ensure no child grows up believing that suffering is normal or acceptable is what it also reminds us of. If you are already subscribed to this channel, you should check. To access deep investigations into cases that society prefers to forget, but we need to remember to prevent them from repeating, subscribe now if you are not. Because you like this story is why if you watched this far. So I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel, leave a comment saying, I watched here. Don't forget to like this video and share it with people who value knowing the truth, however difficult it is. The story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, and the lives forever altered by generations of isolation and consanguinity is what this was. That even in the most remote communities, no one should be beyond the reach of protection, education, and the law is what a story that reminds us.